A big thank you to all of you for joining us in person and on the live stream for our continuing conversation about investing in rural America. Goldman Sachs has been a longtime partner of Punchbowl News, if you can have a longtime partner when you're only a 2.5-year-old media startup. But they have been wonderful, and we've been really thrilled to go around the country with them. This year in particular, we were in my home state of North Dakota to kick off this series, and today we are thrilled to be in Little Rock in Arkansas, my first time here, Jake. The other founder who's joining me on this conversation. So
not my first time.
No. Afterwards, after we have our conversation with the two senators, we're going to be joined by Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon. As always, you can find Punchbowl News at Punchbowl News on all social media platforms. We encourage you to share about this conversation. You can also sign up for our free morning newsletter at punchbowl.news. And with that, I'm going to welcome the two senators to the stage, Senator Boozman and Senator Cotton, please. Well, it has been quite an eventful.
These are comfy.
Washington. Thank you so much. Quite an eventful time in Washington on the other side of the Capitol and the House. But I think Jake's going to kick us off here this morning with a few news of the day questions before we get into kind of rural small businesses and what you're seeing here in your home state.
Senator Cotton, I'm going to start with...
We should be asking you, Jake. You know more than...
I do know more than...
what's going on than
Well,
anybody.
we have a Speaker of the House. That's a good start, right? Okay, Senator Cotton, let's start with what's going on in the Middle East. You have take a special interest in foreign policy, and last night the United States struck Iran proxies in Syria. You released a pretty harshly worded statement saying, I don't want to mischaracterize it, so I'll let you say what they said, and what should be next for the U.S. in the Middle East.
Well, Jake and Anna, first of all, thanks for being here in Little Rock. Unfortunately, Iran believes that now they can push around and attack not just Israel, as we saw so savagely on October 7th through their proxy Hamas, but America as well. Since October 7th alone, there have been, I think, at least 19 attacks against Americans throughout the region. One woman has died. I think we're up to around 20 or maybe a couple dozen injuries as well. So the President and the Secretary of State have said for the last few days that we won't allow these attacks to go unresponded to. And I guess last night was his version of a response. We hit apparently a couple empty warehouses in eastern Syria, which doesn't deter or scare Iran. It validates Iran in their strategy. They've long had a strategy of trying to threaten the United States and Israel through proxy groups that they can deny, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like militias in Iraq, or rebels in Yemen. And if we're only willing to strike Iranian proxies, especially unoccupied proxy warehouses, it simply shows them that their strategy is working. The only thing that will scare Iran into pulling in its horns and stopping these attacks on Americans, especially before Americans die, is to strike at them directly, whether it's Revolutionary Guard Corps leaders traveling in the Middle East, the way Donald Trump did against Qasem Soleimani, their terror mastermind, in January 2020, or directly at Iranian facilities or sites. I just use as a couple examples of that, Ronald Reagan in 1986, because Libyan-backed terrorists bombed a nightclub in Berlin where American GIs frequented, bombed the hell out of Libya. In 1988, Ronald Reagan, after having warned Iran repeatedly not to put mines in the Persian Gulf, when a mine hit a U.S. Navy vessel, sank half of Iran's Navy. In both cases, that stopped the terror-sponsoring state from continuing to threaten Americans. It's going to take that kind of action by the president if we want to actually scare Iran straight.
All right, well, you're going to shift gears a little bit from foreign policy to...
Can I just say something about that? Because it's really, it's great to have Tom in his position on armed services and on the committees of jurisdiction, that do this, and nobody does a better job. I know you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, what difference does it make to me what's going on to the Middle East? And certainly, there's the moral principle. Israel's a great ally. We're going to stand by them. They're a country that was invaded. You can imagine how we would react if we had a bunch of people come in and cut children's heads off and kidnap old ladies, and the list goes on and on. So But think about it. If this spreads, if this continues, if it goes into the surrounding region, what's it going to do to you if you've got $150 a barrel of oil, $200 a barrel of oil? These are real things. The same is true in Ukraine. The Chinese are watching. If we back up there like we did in Afghanistan, then they're going to eye Taiwan. What would it do to your businesses if all of a sudden we, at the very least, we're not trading any with China? You had to just completely redo your supply chains. We saw what it did during the pandemic. So these really are very, very real things that affect all of us in a huge way. And it's something that we really need to be aware of and pay close attention. I think Tom, the next week or so is really going to be critical, isn't it? Thank you.
All right. Very good context. I want to talk about that because another thing I think sometimes people don't necessarily understand is, or they just think Washington has a lot of dysfunction, which it does. It does. That is true. We do have a speaker, but we have a government funding issue that's going to come up on November 17th. That includes a potential $105 billion supplemental funding bill for Ukraine, as you were speaking about, and for Israel. First, we'll start with you, Senator Boozman. Do you support the package? And if not, how likely do you think we are headed for a government shutdown?
No, I don't. And again, there's two different things, a government shutdown and the supplemental is totally different. And so I'm on the Appropriations Committee. We're going to be discussing the supplemental package that was sent over. It's kind of like, Anna, that the president always sends over a budget every year. The budget gets no votes from Congress on either side. I think Tom Carper voted for President Obama's budget once. He was the only guy, and he said he felt like he needed some support. That's why he did it. But this is sent over. It's not realistic. We'll be combing through it on the Appropriations Committee. This is President Biden's idea. This needs to be done on a very, very bipartisan basis. Everybody having input. That's how you get good legislation. So I'm really pleased that it's going through regular order. So we'll get through it and we'll put it on the floor and get it even amended further so that at the end of the day that we'll have good legislation regarding a government shutdown. I don't think we really know yet. The Senate, will be able to come up, I believe, with an appropriations package that's good. We'll have to wait and see in the House. In order to get an appropriations bill passed in the House that the Senate will agree to, because Democrats run the Senate, Republicans run the House. So if the Republican bill is such that Senate Democrats can't live with it, then we're looking at a government shutdown. So hopefully that won't be the case. That's the last thing that we need to do, especially in the times that we're in right now.
Senator?
Yeah, I agree with Senator Boozman that what President Biden proposed is dead on arrival, just like presidential budgets are every year dead on arrival. However, like Senator Boozman said, I support aid for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, and we need to address the crisis at our southern border. But Congress is going to have our say on that. With Ukraine, I support primarily military and security aid. There are certain things that only the United States can do because of our world-class defense industry. Europe has supplied a lot of military aid, but they can also do a little bit more to supply the non-military or non-security aid that the government in Kyiv needs. Second, on Israel, obviously I support the aid for Israel. I do not support any aid for Gaza at all. Hamas does not divert aid. It doesn't commandeer aid that goes to Gaza. It accepts aid. Hamas is the governing entity of Gaza, and no one would have expected us to provide aid to Afghanistan in September of 2001. Or Germany or Japan in 1942 to 45. On Taiwan, there are things we need to do to get Taiwan armed up. A lot of what we do in all three of those crises is spending on our own military, on our own defense capabilities to make sure that we have the munition stockpiles necessary to not only deter countries like China and Iran and Russia, but to win if we have to. And then finally, on our southern border, we have to address this crisis, which is large and yet still growing. And the one thing that I don't think we will do in the Congress is anything that accelerates migration, that makes it easier for illegal immigrants to get here and then move them across the country and house them. We want to focus on the problem, which is stopping illegal immigration. So I think those are the contours you'll see of legislation that comes out of the Congress, whether it's one bill or 4 bills or some number of bills in between there.
Something you guys are both involved with, which is key in your state, is agriculture. The Farm Bill, as you both know well, Senator Boozman, you specifically, is expiring at the end with this government funding bill, correct? I mean, it was extended on a short-term basis, something that's key to a lot of businesses in your state and the economy of your state. What is the future with that?
Well, it's so important. Most of the states, I've had the opportunity, I think, to be in 18 states in the last several months, talking to farm groups there. Usually it's about 25% of the state's economy, number one. But if you get outside of any community of any size in those states, and it doesn't matter where you're at, if you're in Missouri, Michigan, I was in Delaware, same deal. It's not 25%, it's probably 85 or 90%. Most of our counties are losing population. 53% of the counties in America lost population in the last census. Arkansas has 75 counties. I think we lost population in 52 or 53. So agriculture is all that's left. We're working hard to make sure that the farmers have the tools, the risk management tools that are up to date today so that they can go to the bank and get the loans that they need to go forward. And I'll give you a good example of this, and Mr. Solomon could elaborate, but the average USDA loan is like $335,000. If you service that note, paying the interest and things, in March of 2021, it cost you $9,000 to $10,000 to service it. Now it's closer to $24,000, in that range. So that's real money. And so it's not just that; it's everything. So we're working hard. We've got to come up with some funding. We've got to shift some funding around. But this really is critical. What we want to try and do, Jake, is get an extension hooked onto the November continuing resolution, not because we're going to extend it for a year, not because it's necessarily going to take a year to get it done. That gives us some breathing room. What we want to do is make sure that after the first of the year, when the Farm Bill really does run out, that our farmers and ranchers have the ability to have certainty so that they know that, essentially for the next year, they can go to the bank, make the planning decisions that they have, and go forward.
All right, it's time to get to the topic of the day, small businesses and what you're hearing in the state of Arkansas. We'll start with you, Senator Cotton. Can you talk a little bit about, we have a lot of small businesses in the audience, the owners. What do you hear about them when you travel the state of Arkansas, either challenges, opportunities, what you're seeing?
Well, first off, and I think your small business scholars are a good example of this. It's important to remember the diversity and range of business opportunities that you have in rural America. And here we're sitting here in Little Rock, which is the big city for many of us, but it's important to remember that in Washington, where policies are often set, everything in Arkansas is rural. And whether it's in row crop country in East Arkansas or our forestry industry in South Arkansas, manufacturing along much of the River Valley, there's a lot of different diverse opportunities, but there is a common set of challenges as well. Inflation is a big challenge I still hear from a lot of small businesses, especially when it comes to the cost of their inputs as well as labor costs that are increasing and cutting into their bottom line. Small businesses often are challenged by dealing with regulations, especially if they're in a more heavily regulated industry, not just regulated by Washington, D.C., but regulated by state and local governments as well. Giant businesses have large compliance departments with armies of lawyers and compliance officers. If you're a small business and it's just you and maybe a family member and a couple of teenage employees at first, it's very hard to deal with all that red tape. So it's another source of cost and burden. And as John mentioned in his remarks, it's not just the cost and the burden, it's the uncertainty about it as well, especially if you're in a small business that requires any kind of significant capital expenditures and your willingness to spend tens of thousands of dollars when you're first starting out if you're not entirely certain about what your regulatory climate will look like in the future. Those are just a few of the challenges I hear across a wide range of industries that are represented here by your small business owners.
Yeah, no, I would agree totally. I think along with that, the number one thing that we hear about is labor, and it doesn't matter what business you're in. It's just a huge issue in our smallest towns all the way to our largest, and we appreciate people like Pulaski Academy that are doing a good job of helping educate people so that they can have the skill set in the modern economy where you just don't have a lot of manual labor available. The other thing that I hear about is the regulatory atmosphere. You think about a small town that's lost population. I was visiting with somebody in Washington from Arkansas. I think their population was about 24,000. These are just numbers, but essentially now it's like 16,000, okay, in the last, lots of population loss. Well, you think about it, the people are still in the same water utility. That cost is essentially the same. So their water costs go up, their utilities cost up. Most of our small business people are self-employed. So you're looking at your insurance, your health insurance, probably almost doubling this year. These are real costs with inflation that are making it really difficult. The other thing that I hear from the people, the mayors of these small towns trying to make it, and I say small town, it can be a medium-sized town, whatever, but it shouldn't be that if you're trying to get a federal or a state grant, particularly a federal grant, that the paperwork is so burdensome, the regulatory atmosphere is so burdensome that you have to hire, somebody, a grant writer and give them $30,000 to do the grant for a $50,000 grant or whatever. I mean, if you've got a college education, you've got some sense, you ought to be able to sit down and fill the form out. So there's some things that we can work on, and we're really trying hard to. There's a lot of consensus to get this done, but these are things that don't cost money. These are things that would actually make things a lot better without costing a lot. It would make it a lot easier on our smaller communities and, again, our smaller businesses.
Let's talk about access to capital for a minute. We hear about this all the time for small businesses, medium-sized businesses, all sorts of businesses. Do you have concerns about when it comes to increased capital requirements for regional and any financial institution across the board?
As I said earlier, I believe with all my heart, if my brother and I went down, which we did many years ago, and borrowed, significant amount of money, I don't think we could do that today because of the capital requirements, and they're getting worse and worse. And Mr. Solomon will talk about this, but it's difficult. And you combine that with having decades of essentially, very, very slight interest. Now with the it's not that high in comparison as far as the figure-wise, but the multiplier is so much higher. You go from almost nothing to 7 or 8%, whatever it is. That's a killer, okay? So I think that is a real mistake. I think it's going to harm our economy, and we really do need to back off. We need regulation. I'm not saying that at all, but we need to use common sense with this thing and understand where we're at. And the other thing that I think is so important is borrowing money, you can do that, but it's so important to have the mentorship available so that a person that's getting ready to get into a small business has somebody that can say, well, did you think about, this or that? Did you think about, So in other words, having some help to advise them. A lot of small businesses fail, and that's is something that we can do a better job of preventing and making small businesses that and that's really what this program is all about, which is great.
Yeah, I have real concerns about access to capital for our small businesses, and I think oftentimes you have regulatory solutions that actually make the problem worse in some cases. If you look at, for instance, what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, Signature New York, I should say, since we have a great Signature Bank here in Arkansas. These were not really regulatory problems. These were supervisory problems that the administrators, or the supervisors did not catch. An obvious problem that these banks were long long on low interest rate assets and a rising interest market. And they ended up getting bailed out by the FDIC. Why did that happen? It's because they were well connected, not just Silicon Valley tycoons, but then they enlisted all of the businesses that they fund all across America. Well, those companies had divergent interests. There's plenty of opportunities for venture capital funded companies in Arkansas or Ohio or Kansas or what have you to keep access to credit, whether it's through the warrants that FDIC was offering or other alternate financing. It didn't require the bailout of SVB and Signature Bank of New York, but it especially didn't require the new regulatory capital rules that have come out either, to what was essentially a supervisory failure. And although the threshold for those rules don't yet affect a bank in Arkansas, banks in Arkansas can grow, and once you implement those rules, there's a tendency to put downward pressure on how many institutions are affected by them. And again, if you're a big New York bank, sorry, David, no offense. If you're a big New York bank, you can handle some of these things. It may eat into your bottom line, but your revenues and your bottom line are so much higher than smaller regional or community financial institutions that don't have those same abilities to counteract onerous regulatory requirements, especially banks when you're talking about new capital standards.
Yeah, and these banks, too, had huge uninsured balances, much more than a normal bank. And so they got caught that way, bailed out. And so my concern is that a special circumstance, as Tom alluded to, is being used as a means for tremendous increase in regulation that really doesn't have anything to do with the situation that actually evolved.
We are quickly running out of time, but we're going to try to get to at least two more questions here. One, I want to talk about the Small Business Administration. This is something that we've gone and talked to a lot of small business owners over the past couple of years, their frustration with either programs, that it hasn't been modernized. The Senate Small Business Committee actually recently advanced bipartisan legislation to modernize the SBA. It's been more than 20 years since it's been reauthorized. Do you think it needs to be modernized, and do you think this is actually going to happen?
Well, we're 20 years on from reauthorizing it the last time, so that might cause you to place your bets.
The odds are not in the favor.
Opposite, but sometimes it just takes that long in Washington to get around to actually solving a problem unless there's a forcing mechanism. I do think, yeah, of course, it needs to be modernized to some degree because it has been 20 years on. I think Senator Boozman made a good point about the amount of paperwork and the demands on small businesses, again, who are trying to make their ice cream or sell their coffee or work at the construction site, and then they have, forms that require 37 pages to be completed in triplicate, in which you've got to hire lawyers or professional grant writers alone to do. When again, these things are not all that complicated. Now, you don't want to undercut underwriting standards to such a point where you can have widespread fraud or failures, but at the same time, most small businesses, especially when they're starting out and are at the stage where they can most need SBA help, can have pretty straightforward applications and straightforward underwriting procedures as well.
No, I agree totally. And Small Business Administration is one of our smallest agencies, and during the pandemic stepped up and really, I think, did a good job of, in a very, very difficult situation, working with our banks, who also the aid that we were able to keep as we forced people to close down and then keep them such that they were up and could function and then come back was done through small business in our banks, and they did a good job. But no, it needs to be modernized, and as we've talked about today, and that's why this forum is so important, the importance of small business, but the Small Business Administration, is a good influence now. They do the best that they can do. Certainly they can do a better job. We can help them as we go forward because, as we're talking about, I mean, small business truly is the backbone of the country.
This is our last question. I'm going to ask you to play Prognosticator. Although,
I feel
listen,
like we're in the hallway with you.
you've even though you've left the House for a lesser chamber in the Senate, I'll ask you to.
Those are fighting words in Washington.
I'll ask you to prognosticate about your party's prospects in 2024. Mitch McConnell always says, "Never fall in love with the map." I've heard that 1,000 times from Senator McConnell, but you have a good map in 2024. Senate Republicans do. And in my view, House Republicans have a tougher climate in 2024. I'm curious what both you guys think.
Well, I'll let Tom address the map, but
I knew that was coming up.
It's interesting. Tom and I had the pleasure of serving in the House, and our friends are kind of running the place now. But The
Is anyone running the place now?
well, are attempting to run the place now. But the only thing that the House members agree on is their hatred for the Senate. So that's, like you say, that's universal, every one of them. But we do have a good map, and you might want to talk about the individuals, but just states that have drifted into the reddish column. That, like I say, we do have a good idea, of picking up. On the other hand, these are turbulent times. Who knows what the world is going to look like next month, much less, almost a year from now.
Okay, Senator Cotton, it's on you.
Well, to be clear, what Senator Boozman was talking about, Jake Sherman in the hallway, his main profession requires him to stand around the hallways of the Capitol and stick microphones in our faces, which is apparently why he's unfamiliar with a razor these days, because he doesn't have time to shave before he gets to work.
He's trying to look older and just more distinguished. It's hunting season, isn't it?
So I think I don't want to hazard a guess again about the House or the White House, but I'm more familiar with our Senate races, and we do have a lot of embattled Democrats up for re-election, and I've endorsed some Republicans already, and I think they're great candidates. If you look at someone like the governor of West Virginia, Jim Justice, wildly popular, very accomplished businessman. Tim Sheehy in Montana, a young veteran. I guess I'm old enough now that I can say someone's young, but also accomplished businessman in his own right in Montana. In Nevada, Sam Brown, a highly decorated combat wounded veteran as well. So I'm very confident that we've got great candidates who are running. In some other states, we have multiple good candidates who I think will produce a strong nominee after a competitive primary, and that will win back the United States Senate next year. The one thing I'm 100% confident about predicting, though, is that Arkansas will have 2 Republican senators after next year's election.
I feel like that's probably a good bet.
All right, Senators, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank
we
you.
really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Now I'm going to welcome David Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, to the stage for our fireside chat.
We're not going to ask him about the House and the Senate, though, because I think unless you want to weigh in some way.
Yeah, so there's a mic there for you.
You'll pass on that opportunity?
I will pass on that opportunity. I do. Before you start, I do want to take a moment just to thank both Senators Boozman and Senator Cotton for being here today and supporting the initiative. We really appreciate it. It means a lot, so thank you very much.
All right, we'll put you on the hot seat now. We were in North Dakota a few weeks ago, Arkansas today. Why Arkansas, David?
It's a great state. We've obviously run the 10,000 Small Businesses program for 13, 14 years, and it's touched people in all 50 states. But one of the things is we do research. Everything we do is grounded in research. We try to do research and try to really understand what can we do, how can we use our resources to support small business. And as you do research, you start to really understand that when you get into more rural states, and I think what Senator Cotton said when you're talking about Arkansas compared to Washington, everything, even the big city, is more rural. But when you get into more rural states, the prevalence of small businesses and the role they play in the economy even grows. So here, just by number, 99.3% of all the businesses in the state of Arkansas are small businesses. And when you get to the employment level, it's about 55% of all employees. And so the importance of that ecosystem and driving economic growth and support is just very important. And so as we went and we looked around at a bunch of places where we thought we could really expand. We started in North Dakota. We picked Arkansas second, and it's really rooted in that research. And we have about 20 states in mind as we roll out this program over time where we can have further impact. And so we're going to continue to invest in the program. We think it makes a big difference. And we think, as you broaden out across the country, there's just more work to do.
We talk about the scope of the investment in this program that you're making right now.
Well, we've added, we pledged obviously after covering, 14,000, businesses after getting past the 10,000 mark to do another 10,000. And so for this rural initiative, we've committed another $100 million. And then in addition to that, we also continue to commit capital to lending facilities that are operated through things like Project Hope, so we can play a role also in getting capital, directly into small businesses. And I would highlight that's such an important thing for us to do. Bill highlighted the fact that 68% of small business owners, when we survey small business owners around the country, 68% say that they have trouble accessing capital. But here's a more interesting statistic. if you talk to those same business owners and you say, what if the regulatory environment or the capital environment actually made it harder for you to get capital going forward, 85% of them say they would change their investment plans and their growth plans based on that and would change the way they're running their business. And that can't be good for job creation and economic prosperity throughout the country. So it's super important that we find ways to get lending capital, into small businesses. And it is a tough environment for small businesses with the banking system.
Yeah, it was, I think, a year over year, they used to be kind of optimistic about their ability to access capital, and now 66% saying they are not optimistic. It's a pretty quick flip.
It is a quick flip.
Let's talk about the Federal Reserve's new proposal to increase bank capital requirements. We heard the senators address it. But you're the CEO of a bank, a big bank. How do you think this could impact lending to small businesses?
So these new capital proposals, I think, could have a very significant impact to lending to small businesses. And I'd say a couple of things at a high level, and I want to keep it at a high level. But these rules are being proposed as a continuation of what are called the Basel rules. And the purpose of the Basel rules was to try to set a level playing field for regulation on a global basis and to try to set a framework so that you didn't have regulatory arbitrage as capital moves, broadly around the world. For reasons that are really not, clear to us, the proposal that the Federal Reserve has made to complete the Basel rules here in the United States is significantly higher standard, what we call gold-plated, in the industry, and therefore pushing a significant amount of additional capital, if the rules are implemented, into the banking system. By the way, that's for big banks, and that's for medium or large regional banks. And so the result of that, I think, very simply, are a couple of things. And I'd start by saying I too believe in regulation. I think it's important for stability in the United States that we have a safe and sound banking system, and there's been an enormous amount that's been done over the last 15 years to ensure that. The Dodd-Frank regulation basically increased the capital in the banking system. It more than doubled it over the course of the last 15 years, and it not only doubled the amount, the quantum of capital, but also improved the quality of capital, the quality of liquidity, and we have a much stronger banking system. And the result of that, I think, has been beneficial. And you've seen it with the large banks during the pandemic, and at other times when there's been stress. These rules would do three very simple things. The first thing is they would make the cost of capital for large businesses to small businesses more expensive. It's absolutely clear. If you put more capital in the banking system, what banks have to charge to lend that to earn a reasonable return, the banks don't own the capital they have in the system. They take that capital from others. They have to provide them a reasonable return. So the cost of capital for all businesses goes up, large and small. As one of the senators said very clearly, large businesses are better adept at adjusting to that. It may affect their earnings, it may affect their returns, but for small businesses, that can be crippling. Second, it makes the U.S. less competitive. It makes the U.S. less competitive. Why do we want to have differentiated rules that are tougher here? It makes the U.S. less competitive. And third, it pushes activity that's in the banking system that's very important to the economy into the shadow banking system, which potentially creates more fragility and more risk. And so we believe in regulation. We look at these rules. We think they go way too far. They don't do anything to materially improve safety and soundness. The system is relatively safe and secure, but it materially creates headwinds for lending activity. And we think that we are actively with the industry commenting. We also see businesses commenting because this affects businesses, large and small. And I think it's something that really I hope will not get implemented as currently proposed.
So one of the things that small businesses are concerned about is inflation, and you have a unique insight into the economy right now and where we are and where we're heading. So where are we and where are we heading, and how should small businesses look at that?
Sure, and it's certainly not surprising given the journey we've been on over an extended period of time that we wound up, with inflation. And I think, the pandemic. We responded to the pandemic by shutting down economic activity all over the world. That was very disruptive. We're normalizing a bunch of the effects of that. We responded to that shutdown by spending an enormous amount fiscally all over the world. Governments all over the world put an enormous amount of fiscal spending in to compensate for that shutdown. And, the combination of those two things with also very accommodative monetary policy obviously has led to much more significant inflation all over the world than here in the United States. The Federal Reserve has tightened monetary conditions very quickly, the most significant tightening in 30 to 40 years. And, the impact of that is starting to be felt, very acutely. But there's a lag period. It has effectively brought inflation down from double digits, to something that's more like 3 to 4%. But 3 to 4% inflation, is still tough. My own view is inflation is going to be sticky. It's going to be hard to bring inflation back down to 2%. I think the Fed is being appropriate in pausing now and watching, because I think there's a lag effect as to how this tightening of monetary policy, takes place. But I think it's a pretty significant tightening. We should give it a chance to work. We should look at the data and see what's happening. But there are signs around that inflation's still, stuck in. Labor in particular, is one that's having an impact. Now you put the geopolitical volatility in the world on top of that, and what's going on geopolitically is inflationary, and the concerns that were raised about the cost of energy and the cost of oil, if this conflict in the Middle East becomes more pronounced, is something that would obviously have an additional effect, on where we sit from an inflation perspective. So it's been a long time since we've had inflation. Inflation is a hugely significant headwind on economic growth, and for all Americans, it's a very painful thing. So it's important that we combat it. But we're going through the adjustment period, and I think we've got to be thoughtful, put the right policy in place. Policy matters, and hopefully, we'll land the plane, relatively smoothly.
You talk about labor in Goldman Sachs survey, and in a lot of the interviews we've had over the past 2 years, we've heard about the challenges small business owners have when it comes to attracting, particularly a skilled workforce, to work in more rural areas. What role do you think the private sector and the public sector have to try to alleviate that pain point?
Well, it's been very, very tough for small businesses to find labor, and part of that is when you have the kind of fiscal stimulus that we've had, we shrunk the workforce, and we're now rebalancing that, and more people are coming back into the workforce. And so, I think there's some improvement in that, but there's a lag time. I think we as a corporate citizen, 10,000 small businesses is a representative of this. We do not take for granted the privilege to operate any of the communities that we operate in. We obviously operate across the United States. We also operate around the world, and we think it's important that we participate in those communities, support those communities, invest in those communities, and we try to think about it through a lens of what do we have that's unique that can help, the communities that we operate in. Because if we don't support the communities that operate in, we won't be given the privilege of operating in those communities. And so we have capital, and we obviously have business expertise. And so we've tried to find ways to support those communities, and this platform is one of a number of ways that we try to do that. And that can help, create job growth, create opportunity, create economic activity. It's just very important. We all participate in that economy together. We're all in it together.
So I think we're almost running out of time. I have one last question here. SBA, which we talked about needing to be reauthorized. We had some news this morning. The SBA has selected the Arkansas Capital Corporation to be designated as a small business lending company. The first time in 40 years, the SBA has expanded the program and will allow the company to do 7A lending in nearby states. What else does the SBA need to do to modernize itself?
It needs to be modernized and reauthorized. And the senators made very, very appropriate comments on the fact that, a lot's changed in the last 23 years. But this access to capital point and finding ways to really understand what's necessary for small businesses is one of the things we've tried to do with 10,000 Small Business Voices, is to bring the voice of small business into Washington so that when policy decisions are being made, we can make the right decisions to create better access for capital and better support for small business.
All right, we're going to leave it there. David, thank you so much. We really appreciate it this morning.